Okay, this is part 2 of All About Endowments. So in the beginning, we talked about that an endowment is basically a savings account where you don't touch the original amount. That amount can go by many different names. It can be called a corpus. That tends to be what I default to most often, but it can also be called the principal or the permanently restricted amount. So that is exactly what it sounds like. Sounds complicated, but it is permanently restricted. We have a little boundary around that portion because that is the piece we're not going to touch in an ideal world. Now, that's the basics, right? You have the earnings and you have the corpus or the principal or permanently restricted. So from there, we're going to build in our subtleties, our shades of gray, and the different complexities about endowments, right? Well, as we all know, earnings are not guaranteed in the market, right? So investments are not guaranteed to make a particular amount of earnings, nor are the earnings constant in any sort of predictable way, right? Therefore, if you want your endowment to last, that originally invested amount to last in perpetuity, now that's just accountant speak, meaning forever, right? Or for the foreseeable future, for the next 100 years, you're going to need to be very careful about how you spend those earnings year to year so that you protect that original amount. So here's where we get into complexities. So let's say the market averages 8%. So let's assume my fingers are the percentages of the earnings. You do not want to spend all 8% of those earnings, that 8% earnings, in 1 year, because next year you might have like a 3% return instead of 8. And I mean, you could even have a negative return. It happens in the marketplace. So what you're going to want to do, and most nonprofits do this, they put a cap on what they're going to spend. So they have a limit on what their spending allocation will be. That's the amount that they actually spend out of the earnings. So you have your total earnings might be 8, but we're going to have like a cap of 4%. So you can only take up to 4% of the earnings to utilize for, say, a scholarship or some other purpose, right? So this could be for program support. It could be for whatever the donor has designated as the purpose of the fund. And that 4% will then be used in that year that you're talking about. And the rest gets banked into a different section of the endowment. So here I'm going to try to illustrate this real fast. So over here you have your corpus. This is your original amount that's in the piggy bank. And then you're going to have another section of the endowment that is, in accounting terms, cordoned off from the original amount. And that's called your reserved earnings, which is exactly what it sounds like. Just like permanently restricted is this. This is your permanently restricted amount, the corpus. This is the reserved earnings, meaning the earnings we've made, but we're banking for a rainy day when the market does not have such a great return. So if we had 8% return, we spend 4, and the other 4 goes into our reserved earnings over here. So the total amount of that fund, let's say that this corpus was for a scholarship of $100,000. Then we make 8% off of it. We use 4%, so we provide a 4% scholarship, and then the rest goes into the reserve earnings, making the total amount of this entire endowed fund $100,000 plus the reserve earnings. I told y'all I wasn't a finance major. I'm not doing all that in my head. I think it's $4,000, so it would be $104,000 now. That means next year, if the market goes down and we don't get a full 8% or whatever your target earnings is, you're going to be able to rely on this reserved earnings to make sure you can still award that scholarship this year. So there's a little bit more to this. I'm going to go into some more terms, but this video is getting long, so this is the basics. So we have our corpus over here, and we have our reserved earnings. This is also called temporarily restricted. So another word for corpus is permanently restricted. This is our temporarily restricted side of the fund.